Helen never had big ambitions. She thought it was safer not to. She worked for 34 years as an elementary school teacher in the same neighborhood where she lived throughout her teaching career. She raised 2 daughters, took care of her sick husband until the end. With the same patience, she used to keep the house meticulously tidy, though at the cost of constant arguments with the other people living there. After her husband died, no one called her my love anymore. On the other hand, no one ever asked her for anything again. And she secretly loved that, though she was ashamed to admit it. She saw the silence not as something left behind by the man who was gone, but as something earned by her own efforts to live a quiet life, which would soon stop being quiet. At 63, living alone in a small townhouse in the back of a narrow alley, Helen had built a routine made of small tasks and rituals, an invisible fence to guard her from emptiness. Coffee with milk at 6:30 a.m., a short morning walk, a radio show at 10, grocery shopping every Wednesday, crossword puzzles at night. Then came the email. It sat in her inbox between vitamin supplement offers and low-interest loan promotions. Subject: confirmation of enrollment, cultural exchange program for retired teachers. Helen read it, then read it again, and once more, trying to understand why it had come to her. You have been selected for a 3-month volunteer position as a teacher in a rural school in Norway. There was a picture of snowy cabins and children smiling with books in their hands. It was too beautiful to be real. Most likely it was a mistake. And it was. A typo in the original email. It had been meant for another Helen with a similar last name. Helen was about to delete it but didn't. The cursor hovered over the reply button, and for some reason she neither understood nor tried to explain. She clicked. She wrote, "I believe this message was sent to me by mistake, but I was truly touched by the idea. If by any chance there is an extra spot available, I'd love to be considered." Without thinking twice, she hit send. Immediately she felt ridiculous, as if she had shouted in the middle of a plaza. Her face went hot, her chest tight. By her standards, the move bordered on dishonesty. But something about that accidental boldness lit a crack inside her, as if her body, always equally obedient, had stepped ahead of her mind. She, Helen, the invisible widow, had just volunteered to cross the world. That night, before going to sleep, she stared at the suitcase she hadn't touched since her husband's funeral. Instead of feeling pain, she felt uncertainty, and that already was progress. The reply came 2 days later, brief, polite, and surprisingly affirmative. "Dear Helen, thank you for your message. Indeed, the email was sent in error, but we wanted to tell you that your response moved us. As it happens, we do have an additional spot available. It would be an honor to have you with us." Helen read the email standing in the middle of the kitchen just as she got home, keys still in hand. She felt a sudden wave of disbelief, almost childlike, as if the world had finally noticed her, even if by mistake. Then came the panic. Traveling alone, to another country, for 3 months? She had never been on a plane for more than 2 hours and imagined Norway must be beautiful, yes, but cold and slippery and full of salmon, which she didn't like. She didn't tell anyone, not even her daughters. For an entire week she pretended nothing had happened, but the thought kept fermenting in her mind like dough left to rise. It stayed there, quietly expanding. While she walked, while she slept, while she listened to the radio, she caught herself wondering what those Norwegian children might be like. What did the language they spoke sound like? How many layers of clothing did they wear? What would their voices sound like reading out loud? Only on the 8th day did she reply, "I gladly accept. Please let me know the next steps." This time, she didn't feel ridiculous. She felt present, as if she had returned to occupy a space she didn't even know she had left. The gesture was small, but the meaning was immense. Helen, who had spent her life saying yes to everyone else's needs, was finally saying yes to something of her own. With time pressing, she had to deal with paperwork, an expired passport, clothes for the cold, bureaucratic tasks that, for someone like her, worked like a kind of armor. They filled the time, kept fear from seeping through the cracks. The fear was there, of course. She just wasn't going to say it out loud. She preferred to repeat a phrase she made up one night while taking down laundry. It's just a trip, not a life change. But it was. What awaited her wasn't just a different place. It was a different Helen. One who had been hidden inside her for a long time and was finally about to emerge. The flight was scheduled for 38 days from now. Not a long time, but it felt like an eternity. Just enough to get used to the idea, or to abandon it. She spent the first few days going through the formalities. Medical checkup, updated vaccines, passport renewal. She never said, "I'm going to Norway." She only said, "I'm planning a trip," as if she were visiting a cousin in the countryside. In a low voice, afraid of sounding pretentious or worse, unstable. No one she knew, or had ever heard of, had been to Norway. She, the discreet lady from the back townhouse, felt almost like she was breaking some unspoken rule. But in the quiet of her room, between lists of documents and discounted winter coats, something unexpected began to emerge. Not excitement. Something more like an inner reorganization. As if, after so many years tending to everything around her, some part inside her was finally asking to be put in order too. A bookshelf within her, full of untold stories now eager to come out. Helen started having strange dreams. One night she dreamed she was walking down a snow-covered road with bare legs. Another night, she was teaching math to children who spoke a language she couldn't understand, but whose eyes seemed to understand everything. She woke up confused. It felt as if her mind had already begun the journey even before her body. One morning she went to the stationery store and bought a notebook, not one with floral covers or motivational quotes. A plain one, spiral-bound, with lined pages. When she got home, she left it on the table. She didn't write anything, but she spent the whole morning putting the pen in and out of her pocket, as if rehearsing a new handwriting without yet knowing what words she would use. Maybe that was the point. More than a late adventure, this trip was a kind of language rehearsal, a chance for Helen to discover what she still had to say, and who she might become in the saying. Helen had never liked airports. Too much noise, too much light, information flashing on screens without warning, people in a rush with backpacks that looked like mobile walls. And yet, though she wasn't comfortable, she felt capable. She checked in by herself, went through security, bought a chocolate bar at the convenience store just to defy her usual instinct to say no to herself. The plane was big, much bigger than any she'd ever been inside. The flight attendant recited the safety instructions with the weariness of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. It was as if her mouth and arms moved on their own, while the rest of her body had left the room. Helen paid close attention. For her, it felt like the opposite. There was something sacred in simply being there, heading to a country where no one knew her, no one was waiting, and yet something deep inside was urging. Let's move forward. She arrived in Norway on a blue, silent morning. The dry, cutting cold wrapped around her like a warning. The foreign language was just one item on the list of unfamiliarities. The lower sky, the wooden houses, the sound of snow underfoot, the faces that didn't smile by default. There was beauty in it, yes, but a restrained kind of beauty, one that made no effort to be noticed. She was greeted by a project coordinator named Ingrid, who spoke English with a gentle cadence. Though fluent, she seemed to choose each word with care. She handed Helen the keys to the cabin, a map of the village, and a pamphlet with instructions. She smiled with her eyes, and without hurry she left. Inside the cabin, everything was small and practical. A shallow sink, a narrow wardrobe, a heater that hummed constantly. Helen spent some time exploring the space with the delicacy of someone afraid to wake an invisible guest. She touched things as if asking permission. When she opened the window, she saw children riding bikes over packed snow. They wore bright clothes and pom-pom hats. They laughed loudly. She didn't understand a single word, but something inside her answered. The first day at the school was quiet. Helen arrived early, so early that the building was still closed. She waited outside, on a wooden bench from which she had to brush off a thin layer of ice before sitting down. She breathed slowly, watching her own breath turn into cloud. When she was finally let in, she was greeted kindly, but without ceremony. A nod from the principal, a brief good morning from a teacher. A first-grade boy walked past her without looking. Helen wasn't offended. This was the real world. Busy people, routines in motion, and she, a newly arrived piece that still didn't know where to fit. In the room where she'd be assisting, she found shelves lined with books in Norwegian, children's drawings taped to the walls, and an old black coffee machine that looked more at home there than she did. The children arrived slowly, in silence. They walked in, hung their coats, sat down. A little girl looked at her and smiled, not showing her teeth. Helen smiled back. The lead teacher, whose name Helen couldn't retain, handed her a sheet with the day's activities and asked for help with the shyer students. Helen nodded. In practice, she spent the morning walking between desks, trying to interpret gestures, intentions, expressions. Then at the third desk in the last row, a boy dropped a pencil. Helen bent down to pick it up. As she handed it back to him, he said something in a quiet voice. She didn't understand a single word, but she replied with a gentle, He repeated it, this time with a shy smile. And again she didn't understand, but she laughed, and he laughed, and somehow, that was conversation. The next day, Helen misunderstood an instruction. The lead teacher had asked her to pair the students up in twos, but Helen understood it as arranging them in rows. The teacher, though still polite, stepped in with a "No, Helen, like I said," followed by a short gesture quickly putting everything back in order. There was no scolding, no public embarrassment. But Helen blushed. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt like she was getting in the way more than helping. The worst part wasn't the mistake itself. It was the thought that came immediately after. Maybe I shouldn't come back tomorrow. It came fast, like a reflex, like pulling your hand from the fire before you even feel the burn. Back at the cabin, socks wet and toes cold, she tried to convince herself it was nothing, but the doubt kept growing. Almost impulsively, she called her daughters. First, she tried a video call. No answer. Then, voice messages. One of them replied 8 minutes later. "Mom, is everything okay over there? Things here are crazy. Grandma's asking about you. That shelf in the wardrobe fell, remember? We talked about it before you left. And now Julia wants to know about that green coat. She can't find another one. Did you take it? Do you?" Helen hadn't taken the green coat her daughter couldn't be bothered to look for. But she didn't even know how to reply, frustrated to realize that even from afar, adapting to a foreign place, she was still the logistical backbone of the household. And the tone of the message made it sound like she was being selfish for doing, for the first time in decades, something entirely for herself. She spent the rest of the day in silence, tried to write something in the notebook. Nothing came. Put the pen aside and did the dishes, as if that might still bring order to something. The next morning she went back to the school. Not on impulse, not out of willpower, but because among all the things she couldn't understand in that new world, one idea was starting to make sense. Maybe good communication doesn't depend so much on language. Helen tried once more. She called her daughters on a Sunday afternoon when the time difference worked in her favor. The eldest answered. This time, Helen wanted a real conversation. She started calmly, talked about the cold, the school, a new activity she had tried with cutout shapes. She admitted it had been a failure, and that she laughed afterward, alone in the kitchen. She said she was enjoying it, despite the language barrier being a constant discomfort. She said she felt alive in a new way, challenged and capable of overcoming those challenges. In her excitement, she let it slip that she was thinking about staying a bit longer. On the other end, the feeling was the opposite. She heard her daughter sigh loudly. "Mom, Julia's been sick since yesterday. Her dad didn't take her to the doctor because he said it was just a virus. Grandma, Helen's mother-in-law, asked you to call and you didn't. And now you're telling me you want to stay longer?" Helen stayed quiet, and her daughter went on. "Look, This phase of yours is nice and all, but you have a life here, okay? You can't just disappear because you want to play at starting over on the other side of the world. It was the word play that hit Helen, as if what she was doing was childish, some kind of late-life whim. She just said, "All right, I'll call your grandma tomorrow," and hung up. On Monday, during a reading activity, Helen stumbled over a Norwegian word while helping a boy pronounce a sentence. She tried again, and it came out even worse. He laughed, not cruelly, but loud enough to draw attention. Others laughed too. Helen, flustered, handed the book back with an awkward smile. But before she could walk away, a girl from the next row, the same one who had smiled at her on the first day, said something in a firm voice. Helen didn't understand the words, but they made the boys' laughter stop immediately. The room went silent. The teacher didn't intervene. Helen simply nodded to the girl and returned to her spot. And for the first time, she felt there was something there that wasn't just tolerance. It was connection. Small, but real. At the end of the morning, Ingrid called her into the administrative office. She spoke gently. "Helen, I know the days haven't been easy, but I wanted to tell you we've noticed your dedication. The children like you. So does the team." Helen smiled, unsure how to respond. Ingrid continued. "One of the teachers will be going on leave soon. It's not confirmed yet, but if you'd like, we might be able to extend your stay. I'd be glad if you thought about it." On the way back to the cabin, Helen stopped at the market, bought a pack of colorful sticky notes and a children's visual dictionary in Norwegian. Back home, she stuck the first note on the fridge door. She wrote, "Bli nor stay." Since the end of the first week, Helen had been walking to the school without checking the map, and she even made small intentional detours. Sometimes she'd turn left a block early just to hear the sound of different footsteps on the snow. In the classroom, her role was still that of an assistant, but now some of the children came straight to her and asked for help. They showed her drawings. One of them started offering her candy, always the blue ones, as if picked just for her. Helen had begun to recognize tones, patterns, the pause before a yes, and she looked for the nod that meant, "This is good enough." One day, Ingrid invited her for a walk. They went to the frozen lake near the village. They didn't talk much. At one point, they stopped. Ingrid said, as if commenting on the weather, "Almost everything here starts slowly, but the things that start slowly tend to last." That night, Helen printed the form to extend her stay. She still wasn't sure it would be approved, but the gesture wasn't bureaucratic. It was personal, almost ceremonial. She filled in the field slowly, with a steady hand, and folded the paper as one folds a promise. Then she placed a new sticky note on the wall beside the first. On it, she wrote a second word. "Bli sammen," stay together. If this story moved you, like it did Helen, like it moved me, like it might move someone you know, share it. And tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt more understood far away than close to home? Have you ever chosen to stay in a place where no one spoke your language, but they understood your silence?